Hi, this is Chris Marchand of Between the Songs podcast. I'm here with Joe Cook to tell you about another podcast we've created, and we hope, if you've enjoyed Between the Songs, that you'll enjoy this one too.
It's called Nostalgic Future Podcast, and that's what it's all about. Chris and I dive deep into our nostalgia, all the pop culture stuff that we grew up with, and we examine how it's influenced our lives and how that continues today and into the future.
So join us for fun discussions about some of our favorite movies, television shows, music, books. Really, nothing is off limits. We even have special guests on from time to time to talk about some of their nostalgic obsessions.
Check out Nostalgic Future Podcast, available now on all the big podcasting apps, and you can also follow us on social media. It's Nostalgic Future Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and we're at Past Future Pod on Twitter.
Nostalgic Future Podcast, where the past is the only way forward.
Hi, this is Pat Lewis, and I'm here with my guests, The Confessions, formerly the Rick Elias Band. Rick, I was going to start by asking you a question about the name change. Why did you go from the Rick Elias Band to The Confessions?
We changed our name because I managed to insult every A&R rep for every major record label in LA over a period of about a year, and we just figured that we would all grow beards and
Start over. That's probably wise.
Yeah.
So what are your immediate goals?
Yeah, we're working on an album right now, and we're going in February, and I'm going to try and stir up some label interest with it.
Who's going to produce it? Have you made your decision in
I'm
that area?
producing it with Dennis Dager, who is also going to be engineering it. And it'll be done at Red Zone Studios, which used to be Camden Studio A. So it's a real good room, and we'll be doing it there. And we're gonna start out with about 5 tracks. We've got one done already,
Which is
Confessions Love.
In the backside of a dead boy street with a bitch in my heart and a mean bad street. I was missing, I was wild, both man and a child, and crawled into your arms with a guilty smile. I stand accused of a crime. It's the truth, not a lie. This is mine. Confession of love. This is mine, confession of love. I got down on the floor upon my bending knee. I raised my hands to the sky, praying, Lord, please, please, please. Oh, they wasted me, son, they wasted me, cut. Yes, they had me in their hands, but you picked me up when they had me down, when all was left was half a man. I stand accused of a crime. It's the truth, I ain't lying. This is mine. Confession of love. This is mine, confession of love. This is mine, confession of love. This is mine, confession of love. Well, I came to the end of that dead man street with a heart full of soul where a tomb used to be. Said I came to the end of the dead man street with a heart full of soul where a tomb used to be. I stand accused truth of a crime. It's the truth and line. This is my confession of love. This is my confession of love. This is my confession of love. Now, dear, this is my confession of
Well, welcome to Between the Songs, the podcast. My name is Chris Marchand. I'm here with my co-host, Joe. How are you doing, Joe?
Doing great, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. We are back from many months of not doing a podcast, even though we said we were going to do one, because we want to continue to commemorate the life and the work of Rick Elias. So today's episode is about Rick Elias's first solo project, solo record, but it's actually kind of a band record, but we'll get into that. Rick Elias and the Confessions. We're going to be talking about that album today, but we've actually had numerous conversations about, like, what are we going to do? What do we want to talk about with Rick's music? And so that's where we're at today. We're going to do a deep dive into this first album, Rick Elias and the Confessions. Yeah, you have your copy there. Mine, unfortunately, I was one of the, I did the doofus thing. I ordered mine off of Amazon years ago, and guess what? It came without, it was just a CD in a plastic case. So you actually had to get me the liner notes. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I love the photographs in this thing. I sent you all of them, right?
You did, I believe.
Yeah, with the lyrics and everything. There's some great photos in here, and before we get into this record, though, let me ask you this: did you own this album back in the day?
I did not, and so this I purchased it after, let's say, after the Ragamuffins as a band kind of dissipated. I don't know that they necessarily broke up, but they stopped touring and recording. So maybe I would have bought it like 15 years ago, let's say. I didn't own it back in the 90s or anything like that.
So I did not own this probably until maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
But I was familiar with most of the songs on it, and I'll explain to you why. Before we get into the actual album itself, I want to bring up another record that was released. This was just a total cash grab, capitalizing on the success of the Jesus record. Back, where the year's even on here? Probably, let's see, 2000. In the year 2000, let's see, it's KMG Records out of Nashville put out this. You familiar with this album?
I have seen it. Yeah, okay. I've seen it.
So I walked into my local Christian bookstore back in 2000, and this was on the shelf. Now, I, at this point, was a huge fan of the Ragamuffins, and there's a Rick Elias CD on the shelf. This is I think I owned a copy of Blink before this, but this was the first time I had seen an album that had these older songs on it. And as you see, the audience listening can't see it, but it's just a compilation. It's called Confessions of a Ragamuffin Man is the name of the CD.
And it's and it was obviously written and recorded when Rick Elias was a 6-year-old Asian boy. Is that when he was?
So I wish I could find this, because I heard Rick do an interview where he was asked about this album once, and I cannot find it for the life of me. I looked because I thought I had it, but I remember the quote where he was asked about it, and Rick basically asks back, "Yeah, what's the deal with the Asian kid?" Oh, he had nothing to do with this album.
Yeah,
he,
okay.
he didn't know why there was some random child on the cover. There's another kid on the inside.
It's just a kid.
It's just a kid.
Just a kid looking. What is it?
there's-
Just like in a room somewhere? Does he have a shirt on? Does that kid have a shirt on?
The kid doesn't, and it seems to have like, I don't know if that's something like there's something in the background there that you can't really see what it is.
So
And
we
it's-
can assume the Confessions are this young child without a shirt confessing.
Well, but no, because it's a confession of a ragamuffin man. It actually, I mean, the name of the album, which I Confessions of a Ragamuffin would have actually been a better album title, but for some reason, and they even went full in, because in the liner notes on the inside, it actually says, "Sit back and enjoy the early works of one who would become a ragamuffin man." Rick Elias. It's a really, really like almost pointless album. But what I'll say about this is it was available for a short time. I picked up a copy. 8 of the 10 songs from the first album are on this.
Okay.
There's 7 songs from his second album, 10 Stories.
So you get 7 stories, not 10 stories.
And so this is, I for many years I owned almost his entire discography.
That's oh my goodness. I love how they couldn't fit them all on. It's just like, guys, no one's gonna know.
But anyway, so that was my introduction to a lot of the songs from the album we're going to be discussing today, Rick Elias and the Confessions.
And then they grabbed whatever family photographs were, and they're like, what are we going to use for the cover? He's like, hey, Larry, can we use your kid? Larry's like, oh, fine, sure, whatever.
No, he had no idea who the kid on the cover was or why they chose a random kid on the cover.
Well, and what's weird about this, that maybe there's obviously a story here, but it's probably not a riveting story. But here are these 2 independent, they're semi-independent albums, small record labels. Each of those record labels folds. And then guess what? Who gets the catalogs, right? So somebody scooped them up somewhere, right? That's kind of what happened. So obviously you said BMG.
No, it was KMG Records.
Never mind. That's the bargain.
It's the great value BMG.
The great value BMG is KMG. You know KMG. See, I'm even getting that wrong. Okay, never mind. And maybe it's Katzenberg. No, I don't know.
But let's move on to the album that we're going to be discussing, Rick Elias and the Confessions, with an actual photograph of Rick Elias on the cover.
There you go. It makes sense.
And so I was telling you off air earlier this week. So I was looking through the liner notes, and I saw in the back photography by a guy named Henry Diltz. And I knew that name. I relatively well-known photographer, enough that I knew of him. In fact, I was telling you, I own a photograph that I purchased, and that I was a big fan of the late Michael Nesmith. Mike Nesmith from the Monkees was great solo singer-songwriter, and followed Nez for years. And a few years back on his website, they sold these Henry Diltz photographs that were signed by Michael Nesmith. I bought one, and it's hanging in my house. That was a Henry Diltz photograph. And so I knew of this guy, but I was really surprised to see his name in the liner notes on Rick's album. So let me tell you just a little bit of background on Henry Diltz, Chris. And this probably will not be, a surprise to, there are probably folks listening to us who know all of what I'm going to say, because I should have known this. This guy was a legendary photographer. He's still living. He photographed The Who, the Mamas and the Papas, Michael Jackson, Frank Zappa, Neil Young, Jimi Hendrix. He was the official photographer of Woodstock and the Monterey Pop Festival. He photographed more than 200 album covers, and I'm going to show you a picture right now. This is the picture that when I saw it, I gasped. Henry Diltz took this photograph at the concert for Bangladesh of George Harrison and Bob Dylan.
Oh wow, yeah. You found that one, huh? So he was there. He was at the concert for Bangladesh.
There. Yeah, and that's the guy that took this great photograph of Rick Elias, and then took the other photos. There's a back cover of the band, the Confessions, there with that portrait of Elvis in the background.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah.
I would love to know how that came about, but
Yeah.
pretty cool stuff.
That's amazing. Do you want to talk about that in terms of Rick's image? Like, what is he conveying to us on this album cover? What do you, when you look at this guy, if this was a guy that you'd never seen before, and you did show me that ad. What's your ad? Like the Christian music ad?
Yeah, let's talk about this, because I did a little bit of research, and I found and this was published in the Pittsburgh Post Gazette on June 6th of 1990. And this was an ad from family bookstores.
Family bookstores, middle of the road, mom and pop America of Christianity here, right?
Apple pie and yeah. Now, in fairness, this ad was placed in. Maybe we can put this on our website.
Put it up there. Yeah.
This was placed on in multiple newspapers, but the one I printed out here was from the Post Gazette. And this is how, it was Alarma Records, I think, put out the album, right? Frontline. Yeah, Frontline. So this is how clearly Rick was being marketed at that time when this album came out. And there was no doubt. I mean, from the moment you put this CD in, you know that, okay, Christian music was looking for the Christian Springsteen at this point. Because Born in the USA had only been out for 6 years, and so they needed a Christian Springsteen.
They needed to get right on it. Yeah.
So this is the ad. It was an order form, and there's a phone number, 1-800-444-1055. Maybe you can call it and get a copy.
Yeah, they still have a few shrink wrapped copies just sitting in a box somewhere.
Rick Elias and Confessions. Rick Elias, the lyrics in this awe-inspiring recording will reach the depths of your soul. It is music with meaning, with a style like that of Springsteen, Mellencamp, and Dylan. This recording follows the heart rock of America, available on CD for the low price of $12.98, and on cassette for $9.98.
Yeah.
So so as I did my research, I went, I found a lot of articles from that time, and the Springsteen Mellencamp thing is just sprinkled throughout everything that you can find written about Rick in the early 90s. They were really going full into that. This is a guy who's, and even the idea of him writing with meaning. In some of the articles, they kind of dogged a lot of Christian music from the time, and we're kind of offering this as something with more depth, and you could tell that Frontline was really happy and delighted with finding a songwriter, an artist like Rick Elias at that time, and to be able to offer something that they really felt there was substance with.
Yeah. And so if you're looking at this cover, it's basically black and white with some colorization a little bit, in little spots and places. But you've got this guy. I don't know what you'd call the top of it, but I don't know what somebody does to get their hair that way, but it's poofy. It's big. It's big.
It's like
I don't know that it's a perm, but
it's not a perm. It's not really a pompadour either.
It's been coiffed.
It's
something.
It's fluffed up.
It's kind fluffed up. But then,
and the mullet that rivals Mullins's mullet.
Yeah, see, Mullins never had a mullet like this. This is a mullet. This is a tough guy mullet.
This is somebody who truly, like, this man has conviction over this mullet.
Yes, and a little bit of sideburns, right? A little bit of tough guy sideburns with the leather jacket, and if you get into the album enough, you realize it's a West Coast kind of album. I mean, you might be tempted to think it's Midwestern, Southern, or something like that, but no, it's a West Coast album. So when I look at this picture, I'm like, he's standing on the hard streets of LA. This is a man trying to survive, and so he looks tough, right? And he's looking serious.
And I want to point out, since you've pointed out the sideburns, I just think it should be noted for those who own a copy of this, they should pull out their album and notice that Rick on the cover, on the back, is Elvis, and Rick has bigger sideburns than Elvis.
That's right. Shave those sideburns, you hippie. Right. Like Mattingly and Simpsons, right?
I remember that.
Well, and so, okay, so, right. Part of the other artwork is, somewhat of a cheesy Jesus behind his, I wouldn't call him cheesy, actually. No, that's wrong. That's unfair. But he's going for something. He's going for Americana here. And yeah, and it's this classic picture of Elvis. I mean, it's almost the Velvet Elvis. When I think of a Velvet Elvis, like, work of art you're going to buy at a garage sale, they usually use this image of Elvis, but it's this classic Elvis look. So he's as much as he's going for I'm a tough rocker guy, he's also going for nostalgia a little bit.
On the inside, there's actually a Levi's advertisement behind the band there. That kind of, that's very period.
Yeah.
So this is a guy. This is blue jeans, mullets, and rock and roll.
Working class rocker guy.
Jesus and Elvis. You have two kings on the back of that cover.
There you go. Two kings. That's right. Maybe that's what he's going for. That's right. Yeah. So, Stephen Curtis Chapman had a mullet as well, but
yes, he did.
The look and the feel of this is vastly different, right? This is coming from a completely different place, is what we're trying to convey here.
Oh no, yeah. Stephen Curtis Chapman doesn't want to mess with this guy.
Yeah. Now, what's funny is, here's what I would argue is, was Stephen Curtis Chapman actually more of the Bruce Springsteen of Christian music? Because Christian music can't even conceive of a true Bruce Springsteen. Like, this is as hard edge as it's going to get, as Stephen Curtis Chapman. Like, everyone, Rick Elias just groaned from his grave, but sure enough, that's all I mean to say is, like, what I think maybe one of my questions is, was there a place within the contemporary Christian music industry for songs like this?
I think, history has shown us that no, there wasn't. But at the time, they were clearly hoping there would be.
Yeah.
I couldn't find like the total number of sales that this record made. It sold about 15,000 copies in a few, like within the first year, which is respectable. I think what happened was that the subsidiary, the label it was put out on, I think it just tanked, kind of went under while he was like in the middle of the tour promoting the record. And there was some interesting stuff on that. It sounds like there was some corruption involved. But yeah, so it was kind of sad because it was he was really getting some really, really good reviews on this album. The Los Angeles Times couldn't write enough about this record. They reviewed it when it came out. They did a couple different articles on Rick in 1990. In 1999, nearly a decade after this album was released, they did an article called "Hitting the High Notes: Take a Spin Through the 90s and Revisit the Decade's Best OC Pop." So they were talking about the best albums and songs from OC artists of the entire decade. Rick Elias and the Confessions, the album was, and this is not a Christian list, this is just music. It was number 23 on their list, and the song Miles and Miles from the album was number 22 on their songs list. And mind you that this album was long out of print by the time that this article was released, and I had to settle for buying Confessions of a Ragamuffin Man in order to hear some of these songs.
Okay, so actually, here's an argument for why this album stayed in the public consciousness, because I have here my copy of the 100 Greatest Albums in Christian Music, which came out a little while ago, but it was presented by CCM Magazine. Came out in 2001 is when this came out. So it was like they were trying to put a capstone on the century of Christian music. Not really a full century, but at least, like, let's culminate this. And
now there was a famous list that CCM published too, probably a year or so before that book. Is that the same list that was in their magazine?
This is the same list. This is the same list, because this is the list that Amy Grant's Lead Me On is number 1. Number 2 is Larry Norman's Only Visiting This Planet. And number 3, what I would call somewhat controversially, because it should have been higher up, is A Liturgy, a Legacy, and a Ragamuffin Band. Now, again, like, I mean, Larry Norman and Amy Grant, I'm not really going to argue with them. Number 4 was Mark Hurd with his album Secondhand. Number 5 was Keith Green, his first album, To Him Who Has Ears to Hear. So there's a lot of albums on this that some of them are really mainstream, and then some of them are like they're like, wait, what's that album doing there? I would argue Rick Elias and the Confessions is one of those albums where it's like, oh, well, how did that get on there? And so here's my
just out of curiosity, I can't remember. Did Joshua Tree make that list?
It did, yeah, it did make it, which is semi ridiculous because it was like, what was it, like number 12? No, it was number 6. So never mind.
Number 6,
that's pretty high up, which is kind of funny. It's like one of the greatest rock albums of the last 40 years, and it's like number 6. Like.
But hey, Rich beat him.
Rich beat him on there, yeah.
He couldn't beat Stephen Curtis Chapman for a Dove Award. Yeah. Not a single one of them, but he beat you too.
That's right. So here's my theory. It's the same thing as with this LA Times article, which is for music to become championed, people have to become advocates for it. So guess who wrote Rick Elias's article for the Confessions album? It's John Joseph Thompson, who I think many of our listeners will know. He's the guy that runs True Tunes, a magazine, bookstore, but now it's a podcast. He's doing his thing. My theory, John Joseph Thompson, if you're listening, is that he probably wouldn't shut up about this album. He's like, no, we got to include Rick Elias. He's worthy. He's a great songwriter. He's out there doing his thing. I bet other people were around the table like, who again? Like, who? And then, and John's
what number was it on the list again?
It's number 58.
That is relatively high on the list for such a obscure record.
So that's my thing is, I think, whatever John Joseph Thompson was arguing for, he was arguing from like prestige, from what the album was actually worth, like to him as far as a work of art, not necessarily like albums that had really stuck in the public consciousness. Number 57 is Twyla Paris's Kingdom Seekers, which I own on vinyl. Because I found it at Goodwill once.
I met her once.
You met her once? That's really interesting. Okay, I never met Twyla Paris.
Yeah, I went to a Twyla Paris Out of the Gray concert at a high school auditorium.
I like Out of the Gray. They're great.
Yeah.
They're great songwriters.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal guitar player.
Number 59, Andre Crouch and the Disciples, the album Soulfully. So, like it's like Twyla Paris, which is truly, a CCM mainstay in the 80s and 90s, then Andre Crouch with a true legend, right? And then there's Rick Elias. And so what my theory is like, it has to take people raising up the music and putting it back into our minds. Otherwise, we're going to forget about it.
Well, and I think the timing is everything too. What year was that book?
2001.
2001. Okay. So, and again, with this Ragamuffin Man CD, 2000, it came out. This is really on the heels of the Jesus record, My Deliverer being a huge hit. Rick was in the public eye there for a couple years in CCM. And like, I wonder if they had, even 2 or 3 years later published that book, would they have given him that recognition?
Would they? Yeah. And the thing about it is too, and I do not mean to disparage Rick Elias and the Confessions, but the album Blink is just far and away beyond better than Rick Elias and the Confessions as far as the songwriting.
I agree with you too. That was personally for me one of my favorite albums of the 90s period, and still one of my favorite records.
Yeah, exactly. So again, these lists are funny things is what I'm trying to point out. It's just cool that he made the list. If you would you let me read John Joseph Thompson's
absolutely
little quip here? Here's what he says. It's some of it's pretty funny. I'd love to hear his own reflections on this, having written it, 20 years later.
What we should have did was we should have asked him to read it for us.
Yeah, he could have put all of his enthusiasm into it.
Like a book on tape.
There you go. Pause. Here we go. Frontline Records, for all its shortcomings, was pretty good at finding some amazing talent in the 80s. From the streets of Southern California came the gritty voice, incredible songwriting, and muscular guitar of Rick Elias. Though new to the Christian music scene, it was obvious that Elias was a longtime veteran of the rock and roll school of Hard Knocks. His voice sounded as if he'd been gargling chipped glass, in kerosene for 10 years. Yet, it was evocative and melodically rich. His guitar playing was obviously shaped by years of club gigging and various epochs of influence. But it was probably his lyrical prowess that caught folks off guard the most. Elias wrote from the perspective of a person with more than his fair share of regrets. His perspective was equally informed by his very relevant faith and his years of experience on the streets. Relationships in the song Stripped, self-destructive behavior in the song Streets of Rome and Stones, and soul-searching from Without One Word were crouched between bold declarations of faith, such as Confessions of Love, The Word is Love, to great effect. Rick Elias in The Confessions was a gut-level expression of real-life faith amidst the wreckage of the Western world. Elias rocked with the swagger of Bruce Springsteen, and his innate sense of melody brought accessibility to his rock and power pop tunes. His concerts became the stuff of legend to the few who had the chance to see them. Unfortunately, since the Christian music industry really didn't have a niche for thoughtful and mature roots rock, Elias fell through the cracks as alt bands sprang up around his feet like weeds. Eventually, Elias would go on to lead the Ragamuffin Band and eventually make a splash in the pop world by producing, writing, and playing for the Tom Hanks film That Thing You Do. There you have it. There's a lot of places to jump off into different aspects of the discussion. What do you hear? What stands out to you?
Springsteen stands out.
Okay.
Even John Thompson couldn't help himself there. Springsteen, you got.
Yeah.
But it was undeniable. I mean, Rick had a certain Springsteen quality about him, a certain, innately cool swagger to him, and of course the gritty vocals. Actually, it was a great article. It was a really good article. So thanks for sharing that. That falling through the cracks. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that CCM in the 90s, there are a lot of artists who fell through the cracks, a lot of great artists who fell through the cracks. I mean, I think of, even Burlap to Cashmere, we've talked about that band. Like, they made one album for like a decade. They made more records after they reunited than they did. And that was one of the best bands of the late 90s. Is it because it's Christian music is just so narrow of an audience that maybe there just wasn't a place at the table for somebody like a Rick Elias? I was looking at the charts. Confession of Love, was the first single on that album.
As a Christian single?
Yeah, it did fairly well. It hit number 4 on the National Christian Top 40 chart, as published by CCM Magazine in 1990. And that was the first single from the record. A year later, The Word is Love was a single in 91, and it charted at number 8 on the Christian rock chart, not the top 40 chart, but like it was narrowed to Christian rock. I don't even really remember like Christian rock stations.
No.
At that time, do you?
So I don't even know. Yeah, what were there? 3 of them?
What I remember is Christian radio stations would do like 10 o'clock on Friday night, play like an hour of Christian rock.
So there you go. I don't even know how they were charting that necessarily.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. So and all that to say, and they didn't sell singles. I mean, you couldn't go into a Christian bookstore and buy a single.
Exactly.
So I'm not exactly sure how these charts were compiled. It's interesting to see what was on the chart with him. Number 1 that week was, remember Mark Farner from Grand Funk Railroad had a Christian album. He did a Christian version of the old Grand Funk song, Some Kind of Wonderful. That was number 1 that week.
Yeah.
White Cross, DeGarmo and Key, White Heart,
So that's actually what I want to, maybe one thing I want to comment on, which is where within Christian music or even within the general music culture, where does this stuff fit in?
I can tell you what the number 1 Christian album that week was. And if you
number 1 album total or rock?
Total. No, total.
Yeah.
CCM.
1990? Was it a Michael W. Smith album?
No, he was number 2.
Oh, okay.
This is 91, and it was Heart in Motion, Amy Grant.
Oh, okay, of course, yeah.
So
Well,
if you're saying you're wondering where this fits in, number 3 was BB and CC Winans. Number 4, Stephen Curtis,
right.
for the sake of the call. Number 5, Sandy Patty and Another Time, Another Place, and number 7, Rich Mullins, The World is Best I Remember It, Volume 1.
Yeah. Okay, so you have bands like White Cross, White Heart, Petra, that are more into what we think of when we think of 80s and 90s rock, early 90s rock. And so, like, who was actually making rock music, roots rock? That's what John Joseph Thompson called it, roots rock. Sometimes we might say Americana. I mean, was there anybody making music like this within Christian music? Maybe Mark Hurd.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the only one I could think of was Mark Hurd, but again,
pretty indie. He's indie, man.
Yeah, we're talking about falling through the cracks. I mean,
yeah, I never listened to the Choir. I never really listened to them, but maybe they're in a similar vein. But I don't think they were roots rock. I don't think they would be considered that.
Yeah, and I shouldn't say that. I mean, obviously, there are many more than just Mark Hurd. But as far as who had any kind of real notoriety at the time,
the Lost Dogs, who were a super group.
But you got to go pretty pretty underground to come up with names.
Yeah, and so what I'm saying is like, I'll say this: when we did our tribute special, and it was really fascinating to hear people's different stories about Rick. And this is going to be a little bit, people, this is a little bit cheeky what I'm going to say, but people were like, oh man, as soon as I saw that guy, he was just like one of the coolest guys I'd ever seen. And what struck me as funny about that, and this probably has to do with the age that I am, is like Rick Elias kind of always just felt like a dad to me, because he was always an older dude, and I'm, we're quite a bit younger than him. But I mean, maybe he was cool to the people that he met, but Rick Elias was already kind of making dad rock, is what I'm trying to say. Now that sounds mean, but I'm a pretty big advocate of dad rock.
Well, I think hindsight is 20/20, and you can you kind of look at it. I would agree with you today. But when I met Rick Elias when I was 19 years old, like I thought he was pretty badass. I mean,
Did you?
Yeah. He had the cut off muscle shirt on with the tattoos, and he's like, he was a giant. He was like 6'4", and he towered. I mean, I'm 6 foot, and he towered over me. And he was a presence to behold.
I don't disagree with you. It's just that if you think about if Eddie Vedder and Kurt Cobain are the images of coolness in the 90s, here you got a guy coming around that looks like kind of like a 50s grifter. He's looking more like a hard edge guy from the 50s and 60s. He's already retro. That's kind of maybe one of my arguments, which is fine with me. It's kind of what I'm about too. But I'm just like thinking, they're going, okay, here's a guy who just doesn't quite fit. And it's not like his music's weird. His music is not weird at all. It's like it's American rock is what it is. But he doesn't quite fit any good genre. Yeah.
Well, this goes back to the whole thing that people have been trying to figure out for years, and that is, how did Rich Mullins actually have success in the Christian music industry? Because what you're asking, well, who fits that of the time that had success? Mullins is really the only one that I can come up with. I mean, when you look at this album, number 7, the same week, Hard in Motion is number 1. Number 7 is World is Best I Remember It, Volume 1. And it has Calling Out Your Name, a song about Kansas on a hammered dulcimer. This is as Americana as CCM has ever gotten.
There you go.
In the mainstream.
Yeah, that's right. So they found each other. They found each other eventually. Well, okay, so I just briefly want to touch on his voice, which I think is, I mean, I would invite people to listen to the Confessions album just for his voice alone, because we might be tempted to think like he just has a razor edge voice, but the guy can sing, man. He has pipes. He can belt.
How did Thompson describe? How did he describe his voice in the article? It was.
It sounded like he'd been gargling chipped glass and kerosene for 10 years. I don't disagree. It's that's kind of like a rock critic's, fun way of trying to talk. Like that's some rock critic speak right there. But it's like, yeah, where'd this guy get this voice? What I think is actually really funny about John Joseph Thompson's description is he keeps mentioning the streets. It's like did Rick Elias grow up like a feral, cat? Like he's just like he's always just like like fighting his way off the streets. It makes it sound like, like that's all he's been doing the last 10 years of his life. But I guess there's some truth to that. I really don't know what you picked up on. We've listened to some interviews.
He was a working musician. I mean, and
yeah,
in a traditional working musician sense. Maybe not Rick Elias did not, as a teenager decide he was going to put together a great CCM band and go out and play, every church in the Bible Belt. He played in clubs and bars and in the Southern California, music scene and learned, how to play, in bands at 15 years old, playing, crummy gigs, which is not necessarily, the story you hear in CCM with a lot of bands.
Yeah, I like the idea in listening to his details of this early stage of his life or of his career, that he didn't write these songs for the Christian music industry and didn't even know that it existed. He
didn't know what the Christian music industry was.
Yeah. So that's something else to consider as we're, looking through these lyrics that are certainly tinged with faith and his belief in God. And at the same time, like I could imagine Christian radio didn't know what to do with some of this stuff. And so, yeah.
Well, and it's an interesting thing though, because he didn't know anything about the Christian music industry, especially in the 80s and 90s when he was getting involved in it. But he did have influences in the early Christian music. I mean, he was a big Larry Norman fan, Randy Stonehill. He used to go see those guys in the 70s and was really influenced by them. And I know Larry Norman was a huge influence on him.
Larry Norman was an enormous influence on me as a teenager. He used to come into San Diego and play. I would go to these Youth for Christ events, and unbeknownst to me, we had the largest Youth for Christ chapter in the country. And Larry would come down, as would Randy, and a lot of those early Jesus guys, and with enormous influence on me. I remember meeting him once when I guess I was 17, had long hair, my John Lennon glasses. Somehow got backstage, and Larry looked at me and he goes, "You're in the business, aren't you?" And I went, "Well, I am now." It was like you might as well have just knighted me.
There's a song on the album, the song "Stripped." All right. Well, the song "Stripped," which personally, I mean, it's just a tremendous track, and it's probably one of Rick's more memorable songs, and I think this one holds a really dear place in the hearts of so many of his fans. But I have to admit, it's one of the ones I didn't know, because on that Confessions of a Ragamuffin Man album, it's one of the only 2 songs from the album they didn't include. So I didn't hear that song for till years later. I think I probably heard a live version of it before I even heard the album version. On Facebook back in the day, Rick did he did a live acoustic recording that he posted, and this is what he wrote about this song. And he said, "My friend Luis Alberto Urrea and I never missed a chance to see Larry Norman when he came to town. There was something in his music and demeanor that told you it was okay not to fit in, to be an outsider. Years later, after a lot of bad choices and hard-traveled roads, I was broken. I thought about those days to his music. As a result, I wrote this song, so clearly influenced by the man, with the exception the lyric is literally a page from my journal. It's a prayer, I suppose, to anyone at the end of their rope or on the threshold of a new beginning that has ever had." And he said the song is "Stripped."
Rain down your tender mercies, cleanse my heart of dark secrecy. You know how soon I'd buy back 1 second if I could of each hidden infidelity. I clothe myself betrayed. Still a tear mirrors the reflection of every blemish and every stain. I am stripped, but not afraid. Yes.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I think it was really kind of touching to hear, that. And I know he talked about Larry a little bit on one of the interviews that he did. The guy up in Canada.
Oh yeah, Drew Marshall.
Drew Marshall. He did on the Drew Marshall one. He talked about he told he talked about getting to know Larry like years later after Rick had a little bit of success, and how the Christian music industry had really beaten Larry up.
Oh, I remember that one. Yeah, of course. That's a really memorable moment in that Drew Marshall interview. He saw Larry coming into a bathroom at like the Gospel Music Association, like at a Dove Awards. Isn't that right?
But I have a very sad story about him. Early in my career, when I put my first record out, and it was very well received before the label kind of went belly up. The L.A. Times called it one of the best 10 records of the year, that kind of thing. So in L.A., it kind of had some steam. And Larry lived there, as did we. And I had run into him, gave him my phone number, I told him what a fan I was. He called me a couple times. We had a couple of rather really neat conversations that immediately would turn surreal. And yeah, it was crazy. And the sad part of this is a number of years later, fast forward to Nashville, I'm living here and I'm working, and I'm kind of hitting on all cylinders. Things are going well. And it's GMA, and you've been to that, I know, and at the Renaissance Hotel there, or the Stouffer as it was called then.
Yeah.
But there was Larry, and he was kind of holding court with people that, like myself and others, that loved him and knew him, but kind of ignored. Well, the day goes on, I'm doing interviews, maybe I played, I can't remember what it was. I'm on my way out to my car, it's about 10:30 at night, stop into the restroom to, relieve myself. And there's Larry in the bathroom of the lobby with his shirt off, toweling himself off like a homeless person. Not invited in. I don't know where he was staying. I don't know what was going on. And it just floored me.
Huh.
Man, this guy was my hero, growing up. And I know he had his people that supported him, and I think that was a wonderful consolation to him in his later years. I would try to keep track of him, where he was and where he was playing.
He was like, "This is how we treat our legends," right? Isn't that kind of what he said?
Yeah, and it was. I think it was in the same interview he said he was talking about how Rich never got a Dove Award, and how when he was nominated for the Jesus record, the Ragamuffins decided to just boycott the Dove Awards that year because they said he said they never gave him one when he was alive when it would be any good to him. So why bother now?
I just don't understand, and I didn't understand. And that's why we refused to attend the Doves or receive the Dove Awards when we were up for them for the Jesus record. I don't understand how an industry could so completely and resolutely ignore and shun not only Larry, but Randy, Rich. They didn't give Rich the Artist of the Year until after he died, when he didn't need it anymore. And it's just like, what can you say about these people? And what good are they? And I'm glad they went under. And I hope they stay under. Because that's really where they belong. They never, ever represented the artistic community that supported them and gave them something to stand for. They were, and it's just a sad thing to me that there's never been any real recognition on any significant level. Because certainly when we come into Christian music, none of us expect to get rich. Most of us don't. None of us expect worldly fame. We don't get it. At least be recognized by your family.
Yeah. One thing to go back, you talk about Stripped, and there's also the song Without One Word, which I'm pretty curious about. So there's history here to be uncovered. I don't know if Linda Elias would be helpful to us in some regards, but Rick details how he had a tough decade. He had done a lot with music and just kind of burned his bridges relationally and in whatever industry he was trying to gather up out there on the West Coast, and really found himself in a low place of his life. But as he met Linda, as he found God, as he began to turn his life around, the songs begin to come. And so he talks about how this album, The Confessions, is when it's an outpouring of the last few years of his life, when his life really began to turn around. And he even says the song Without One Word, there were earlier versions of the song that had better lyrics. I'm really curious about that. I'm like, yeah, what was in those earlier versions? Do you have any sense of that?
So I don't. I've never heard it. I would love to, and maybe somebody listening, somebody that
he said there's a demo. He said there's a demo out there somewhere.
Maybe somebody has that.
Not that it exists, but
maybe somebody has it, and I would love to hear it. Love to share it on Ragamuffin Archive. But the interesting thing about that is I listened to the same interview he did with Aaron. He did an interview that people really should check out. We need to put links on our site.
2 parts. It's like 2 hours long, basically.
There's an incredible interview with Aaron Smith, drummer from the Ragamuffins. I think it was in 2017. Rick went on his show, and he opened up like I've never heard Rick open up before, and really shared his life story. And it was a really tremendous interview. And he talks about Without One Word, and he calls it the first really good song of my life. When he wrote that song, he felt it was the first really good song that he had ever written.
So I get through that whole overdose, all the hell that I put myself through in the 20s. It just kind of came to a head around November of 84 when I was 29. And now I'm in my 30s. Now I turned 30 in January 7th of the following year. And for the first time, I finally, in that garage, on the garage floor, with just my guitar, I finally write the first really good song of my life.
Really?
It was the first song that I ever thought. I mean, I could have gotten signed with the songs I had written over the previous years. They were okay, and I had a good band. I had a great band, really, a great little 4-piece band. But the songs weren't that good. I finally wrote a really, really good song, and that was really the beginning of my what do I want to rebirth as a musician, because I knew my days, the chance to become a pop star were over. So now what it was going to be, what if you're going to do this, how are you going to do it? You still have a creative. Are you getting better? Are you becoming a better guitar player, a better singer, a better writer? What opportunities are there out there for you? And sometimes all we need to see is that we're actually getting better at what we do.
Do you remember the song?
That's all the encouragement. Yeah, it was called Without One Word.
But it's interesting. I found a review. Los Angeles Times in August of 1990 did a review of the album, and they talked about this song. And I found a couple things on this song, and it's pretty interesting.
Oh, that's good. That's good because I'll be honest with you, I don't exactly know what it's about. To me, if I were to guess, it seems like it's a song about how toxic he is as a person. Like it seems to be.
I think you're right.
Yeah, it's just like here. Hey, if you get to know me, I'm gonna mess you up because I'm a messed up person, and I'm gonna bring with me all my baggage, and you're gonna find what it's like to be in a relationship with me, and it's gonna be great. And I'm so that's kind of how I hear. That's how I see the song. What'd you find?
Okay, well, I found a couple things on this song. First is a review that the Los Angeles Times published on August 30th, 1990. And in their review, they write, "Allusions to hard, bitter times full of self-disgust and selfishness dominate Without One Word. A clenched, gutsy acoustic ballad that is unrelenting in its depiction of a confused, out-of-control soul. While Elias grapples with spiritual concepts, some of his songs are out and out prayers. His music is coated with the sweat and grime of lived experience.
Yeah.
The other thing I found, and this is really interesting, if you contrast this with the interview he did nearly a quarter of a century later with Aaron Smith, this is Rick in September of 1990 talking about his relationship with Frontline, the label. And Elias said he was persuaded by the label's willingness. So he basically is talking about how he ultimately decided to sign with a Christian record label, and he was persuaded by their willingness to accept and admire a song like Without One Word, a harrowing confessional full of images of confusion, emotional cruelty, and suicidal self-disgust that removes it far from typically affirmative Christian pop fare. Frontline, and this is a quote from Rick now, Frontline has presented me as I am and helped it gain acceptance within that very conservative Christian music marketplace. And it's interesting because in this article in 1990, he's basically praising Frontline for the guts they had to let him put a song like that out. But, and as I'm sure you've heard, and if people listen to Aaron's interview, he kind of has a different take on that years later. In fact, he goes on and talks about what you were saying, how the early versions were much better. And he even says that basically the record label kind of emasculated the song.
And it's on my first album, but I kind of had to emasculate it a little bit because the theme is so dark. And I think they were just a little concerned that it was too dark. The best versions of the song were from 4 years before I made that album. So when I'm talking about 85, when I write the song, I don't really make my first solo album till 89. So all those songs on that first album, I had written on the streets. You know, I went from being Keith Richards to, you know, Ward Cleaver overnight. I've got kids. I've got, you know, I've got a job at a law office. You know, I mean, it's like what happened? We're still going out and playing. I kind of kept bands together. Very hard to do in LA. But I was getting better as a writer, and all those songs that are on my first album, that one that, you know, people like so much, I guess, they were written over that 4-year period. I didn't even know what Christian music was.
Yeah, yeah. So in some ways, we might say that he censored himself. He gave not that the version that we have on the album is untrue. It's just that there's a version where there's a truer sense of where he was at when he wrote that we don't really hear here.
I think in the interview he basically said that he thinks that the label was just afraid that maybe the song was just a little too raw or just a little too much. And so there was kind of pressure, but at the time he's sort of praising them for, you know, seeing, you know, his vision and helping him get that song out. And it's just interesting how, you know, when you get a couple decades behind you, you can sort of look at those compromises and they don't quite sit as well as they do at the time.
Yeah. That's the thing is looking back, it's just like, oh, no one cares anyway. Just put out the song, you know, like put it out as you wanted to do it. And it sucks that, you know, people had to give into those market forces, even though this album wasn't finding a massive audience anyway. So they might as well have just done it, you know? Yeah,
absolutely. It's a shame. I'd love to hear those or the early demos if anybody's got them.
I will say this about the song Without One Word. That's where the Dylan really comes out on the album. Like, and absolutely. There's even a few lines where he delivers the line, you know, he kind of gives that Dylan nasal tone, you know, like he gets a little bit of that kind of stuff in there.
There's a house where prisoners worship, where honest men confess. I admit I was a thief to the darkness in my chest. I admitted to the thrill of the killing that I'd done. It was was funny, man, it was tragic, the kind of person I'd become. I would help you up a ladder to watch you dangle from her rope, and I would shine a light upon you to make you see a ray of hope. I'd scratch and kick the love you give, watch you bleed and lie down hurt. Then I'd change my mind and kiss you and say it all without one word. Hard to become a callous, big as a fist and hard as steel. Like 1,000 souls before me, I met my man, I made my deal. When I thought about it, I'd laugh and cry till my eyes were swollen shut. It was funny, man, it was tragic, the kind of person I'd become. Up a ladder to watch you dangle from a rope, and I would shine a light upon you to make you see a ray of hope. I'd scratch and kick the love you give, watch it bleed and lie down hurt. I'd change my mind and kiss you and say it all without betrayal, I put my temple to the gun. I felt my finger twitch, then it was over, man. It was. I would help you up a ladder and watch you dangle from a rope, and I would shine a light upon you to make you see a ray of hope. I'd scratch and kick the love you give, watch it bleed and lie down hurt. Then I'd change my mind and kiss you and say it all without one word. I said it all without one word. I'm sorry.
You're listening to Between the Songs. For the past hour, we've been taking a deep dive into the album Rick Elias and The Confessions, and we're just getting started. We've got a lot more to discuss about this record in our next episode. So, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to Between the Songs Podcast. Check out our website at betweenthesongspodcast.com, and of course, we're also available on the Ragamuffin Archive YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon for Rick Elias and the Confessions, Part 2.